Hello and welcome. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us today. Today we've got a webinar on DraaS best practices, 5 critical recovery steps. And we've heard a lot about disaster recovery as a service and sorry about that. And we've also had a lot of conversation about how that product works and things like that. In this webinar, we're going to talk about how to really analyze those different solutions that are out there and make those work. So joining me in the conversation is Jason Earley. He is a senior solutions engineer for Carbonite. Jason, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, George. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So before we get started, a couple of things. So first of all the audio is through your speakers. There is no dial-in. So if you're looking for a phone number or anything, please just kind of turn up the volume on your PC and you should be able to hear us just fine. You can get a copy of this presentation at any time by going to storageswiss.com. So feel free to do that. The other thing is to know that we have an app that's available. It's actually the BrightTalk app. It's available for iPad, iPhone, and Android. You can either stream or download our presentations and our webinars. So just download BrightTalk, and then our channel, if you're a subscriber to our channel, should automatically add in for you. And so you can go back and there's a screenshot there of all the different things. The other thing is ask questions. So at the bottom of your viewer there, or kind of near the bottom of your viewer, there should be an Ask a Question tab. Click on that, type in the question you might have, and we've saved plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation. So feel free to do that. If you're an on-demand viewer, we don't want you to feel left out, so please tweet us questions at Storage Swiss, and then use the hashtag DraaS5steps. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, please take a moment to provide feedback and rate the webinar. There's a 5-star rating system, and there's a little text box there that you can put kind of just your thoughts and comments on the event. So we like both of those. Now, so just some background on me and Storage Switzerland. We are an analyst firm focused obviously on the storage market. Our primary way to get that information is through product testing and interaction with users and suppliers. Also, we work a lot with vendors to do testing, things like that. You can find the results of all that research on our website at storageswiss.com. As far as background on me, I am the founder and lead analyst of the company. My background is really twofold. I spend a lot of time in the high performance storage market. So all flash arrays is probably what you would think of mostly now. Then also I spent a lot of time in disaster recovery planning, backups, things of that nature. So those are my 2 areas of specialization. I've been doing this for about 25 years, and we've spent an awful lot of time involved in working with disaster recovery as a service type of options. Now, Jason, why don't you tell the folks a little bit about you, and then go ahead and advance to the next slide and talk a little bit about Carbonite.
Okay, thank you, George. Hi, everyone. So I've been with eVault Carbonite for about 8 years. I've had roles in support. I've led our cloud disaster recovery offering. And now I'm a solutions engineer based in Los Angeles. Before that, I had 10 years in the Air Force, also working communications and computer systems. Now, as far as Carbonite, we are really a company focused on data backup and disaster recovery. whether that's for consumers, for small and medium businesses, for enterprise, and we've been doing that successfully for many years. So look forward to having a nice discussion today.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Appreciate that. Now, the other thing that we need to do before we get too far going is to have a polling question. And you can see the polling question right there on your screen. And it really helps Jason and I both as we try to determine kind of where you guys are that are watching. We've got a lot of viewers today. And kind of what your biggest concerns are so we can start to address those. So if you would do me a favor and go ahead and vote. Again, the voting tab is at the kind of the bottom of your player there. If you would click whichever one makes the biggest concern for you. So the question is, what's your biggest concern about disaster recovery as a service? Is it the time to recover after you declare? Is it how complete is your recovery going to be? Is it the viability of the vendor? Is it the long-term? And good to be true. So we'll let those votes come in and see where we land a little bit there. Jason, you know, if I kind of look at it, there's really no clear leader here. Well, I guess completeness of recovery is starting to surge ahead, but a lot of people have a lot of different types of concerns, right?
For sure. I mean, they're all tempting, right? I mean, put yourself in the situation of any one of them, right? Even if you have a complete recovery, but D fails you, will it work? And it's not working, you're in trouble. So, but then it works great, but it's, you know, a full week to get you recovered. That's not really very practical. So they're all very tempting answers.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll give you guys some more time. Because like I said, there is a lot of you on there, and geez, a ton of you are voting. Appreciate that. In fact, if you haven't voted, you're one of the people that are keeping us from 100% participation. So I don't want to make you feel guilty or anything, but it is kind of on you at this point. Jason, it looks like completeness of recovery is going to win by a nose, so to speak, at about 35%. The general will it work is in second at 28%. Time to recover is at 26%. And interesting, vendor viability is only 9%. I really thought that would be a bigger concern. And I guess maybe just the other concerns are more critical to folks.
Yeah, I think the other concerns, right, are my servers actively functioning? Was it quick? Is it working? I think that's a lot more, you know, in your face, practical than perhaps the more historical or futuristic vendor viability.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, we are going to, so first of all, thank you everybody for voting. Really good participation. We're going to stop the voting there. Roughly 36% of people were concerned about completeness of recovery, but pretty well spread throughout. So we'll make sure we hit each of these topics in detail as we go through the presentation. So I think the first thing to start with was just to kind of frame it up. I mean, I think maybe for a lot of people, you kind of know what DraaS is, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, well, you know, what exactly is disaster recovery as a service? Well, it typically means that a service provider of some type will provide the software to back up and recover your organization's applications and its data in their data center or a data center they rent, right? And so I use that term because a lot of times, Jason, I'll hear people refer to the cloud like it's some magical place, and instead it's a, you know, really all the Amazon, Google, and all those guys, they're just another data center, right? Nothing magic there.
Right.
And so it's, you know, that.
Right. I mean, everyone has to exist somewhere, right? So if you go past the major data centers across the country, across the world, right, all the big names are in there, right? So everyone's data has to sit in some data center somewhere, and even these public clouds. Exactly.
Now, I think the second thing is that we need to think about is, you know, as you kind of look at these options that are out there, and this is an interesting market to me because 3 years ago there was nobody, and now there's like everybody's in it, right? So it's like, boom, exploded overnight. And what we see, though, is, and I think one of the things we'll really spend some time on today is how the vendors deliver that above goal varies wildly from vendor to vendor, right? There's a lot of mix between the different vendors and how they deliver the solution, and not only just like tactically, how does it, how do they get data to the cloud or to their data center, but B, how do they execute a recovery and deliver you what you want, right?
Well, I think you're right. I think the underlying technologies are different in some key ways, and therefore the services that these vendors can offer are different, perhaps based on how they're going to recover your systems, how much manpower they need to apply, how quickly, what kind of contracts they can put in place. I mean, a couple of the large drivers that have enabled all of these new vendors to pop up, I think, are, virtualization, these public clouds, high bandwidth, getting customers to and from the data centers. So it just makes more sense, even from an economics perspective, to be able to offer this service to lots and lots of customers. Let them share the price, if you will, of that rented equipment.
Exactly. And I think one of the big, attractions to disaster recovery as a service is that in the old days, so to speak, you had to go buy a second facility and essentially own it all, full time. And that was a big expense to make. Now, if there's anything that makes sense to rent, it's probably a disaster recovery site, because you probably won't need it. And if you need a DR site full time, you might need to look at where your primary center is located and think about moving. But I think the key here is that IT professionals can't afford to assume that just because the guy says, I have disaster recovery as a service, that he's just like everybody else, right? There is a significant...
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Because especially the responsibility for him, right? The IT professional himself in the event of a disaster, or even throughout the year, as far as who's documenting the testing or interfacing with the auditors or whatever it is, updating the DR plan, may vary from vendor to vendor, from contract to contract. So it's in his best interest to confirm all those details up front, because in the event of a disaster or day-to-day, his responsibilities may differ based on what direction he goes.
Exactly, yeah. So let's kind of dive into the meat a little bit here and talk about the 5 critical elements for disaster recovery as a service recovery success. Wow, that's a big word. That's a big set of words right there. So the first part is, and I think that the completeness of recovery was kind of an interesting winner, is, this ability to cover the entire environment, right? I can distinctly remember working for a few backup vendors in my early days, and one of the challenges was that, when, for example, I worked for a vendor that was really good in the old Unix environment, and when this thing Windows came out, and Windows NT came out, and people started using it, and we didn't have a way to protect it, and that really kind of caused a problem, right? And so, I mean, what we see, generally speaking, is that some vendors only cover either one platform or one operating system, or they require that if you're going to recover in their cloud, that they might be able to protect it, but to provide recovery, or this hosted recovery, that they can only do it on certain systems. You guys see that when you're out there as well?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there's some homogeneous environments out there. There's Windows-only shops, there's Linux-only shops, absolutely. And if that's your kind of shop, then you may just find one vendor, one and done. But there's a lot of heterogeneous environments out there where they may have some IBM I series, some AIX, some HPUX, Windows, virtualization, Linux, Unix. And so there, rather than having to go with multiple vendors, multiple recovery strategies, and they're trying to keep track of, okay, which contract am I on, which agreement, what's my strategy here, have I tested this year? You want to find, ideally, a vendor who can handle all of your different workloads and use the same recovery space, same recovery strategy, same team to bring up all of that in unison. It just really simplifies for everyone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's really super critical as we start to kind of work with these things. Now, the other thing is that some vendors can only manage and protect virtualized systems, right? And so the ability to host, and you know, if you look at most environments, right? Most environments have something more than just a virtualized environment, right? And so, and a lot of times that not virtualized environment, sometimes it's old stuff that you just don't want to virtualize for whatever reason, but a lot of times it's like super critical, right?
Right, and you ask some customers, well, why haven't you virtualized, you know, XYZ server, XYZ application? And they'll specifically say, because of its critical nature, because it's so important, we haven't taken the jump with that particular application yet. It has to be up all the time, whatever it is. And so you're right, while there's been a large push towards virtualization, certainly nowhere near 100% virtualized across all customers. And those, even if they're legacy, those older servers or those critical servers, they need a strategy. They need to be protected, and often they're some of the first that need to come back.
Yeah, exactly. Now, so talk a little bit about, so when you're out there, you see environments that have something other than, like, just say pure VMware, don't you?
Absolutely. I mean, we'll see customers that have some VMware, some Hyper-V, have some physical Windows servers, even some older operating systems from Windows, even stuff that Microsoft has end-of-lifed. Then we'll see some Linux out there, see some IBM iSeries, some Oracle across different operating systems. So there's really a mix out there, and it's not just, well, you're going to go and you're going to find 100, you know, vSphere VMs, VMware VMs, and you're done. It's a lot of a mix, and you have to have a solution that can not only protect those systems, back them up, but also recover them, even if you're taking physical servers to a virtual recovery space. Some operating systems cannot be virtualized, like the IBM I, and so you want a vendor that has actually got, you know, IBM hardware on the back end to recover that as well. So it's kind of that mix.
So, Jason, one of the questions we got, sometimes I like to take a question in line, but one of the questions is, you know, so for example, you're talking about like my Microsoft SQL cluster that I'm never going to virtualize, and I think that's like dead on, right?
Agreed. You've got your physical SQL cluster. You're not going to virtualize it. You don't want to take a chance with that. So whenever you're out there talking with vendors, you know, you're getting your proof of concepts, getting your demos, you want to include that in the discussion. Well, I know you can handle, you know, 95% of what I got. What about my physical SQL cluster running this specific version? And in this specific scenario, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? And get that tested and documented.
Exactly. Yeah. So now moving on. So the next thing I think we got to talk about is meeting the RTO and RPO expectations of the environment, right? And so there's a couple of different things. I think, Jason, you and I did a webinar a while back on our, you know, and we talked a little bit about RPO and RTO, but really to me, there's two key ingredients, right? The first is you increase the frequency of the protection event, right? Because that is, the more often we're capturing data, obviously the less data that has to be rekeyed. In a database environment like our friend that has the SQL cluster, the less I have to play transaction logs, things like that. And so then it's also how quickly does that data make it from the primary site to the DR site, right? And so that's not just buying big pipes, that's also making sure that you have technology in place that leverages that capability, right?
Well, that's exactly right. I think it's like this. The IT managers, the IT professionals, we don't want to be in an uncomfortable situation when a coworker comes to us, maybe a CEO, CIO, whoever it is, and they say, I need my data back, and we don't want to be in that spot where we say, well, I can get it back as it was yesterday at noon. Well, that's not really good enough. I've lost a full day of work. Similarly, we don't want to be stuck waiting on the recovery. Okay, it's almost there, waiting 24 hours to get the data back. So it's got to be fast, but also you have to be protecting it many times throughout the day so you have a really good recovery point to go back to, something that satisfies so they don't lose a lot of data that they've entered.
Exactly correct. So so now the other thing to think about as we kind of look at these options is also the speed of recovery, right? So, and part of that is now, especially in this sort of cloud provider model, is how fast can the data be repositioned, right? How quickly can we move data from point A to point B? Do we have to move data from point A to point B? And then also, how long does it take to kind of re-index and sync and things like that, right? And so those are, and these are questions I think that you really have just got to flat out ask your provider, right? You can't really assume. You got to say, okay, when I call you guys up and you start to recovery, what does that look like? And I think it's reasonable to expect your provider to say, okay, well, when you call, this is what happened, right? You think that's a reasonable request?
It absolutely is. You definitely want them to detail the recovery process. And if you have different operating systems, get them to detail that. If you have some physical, some virtual, get them to detail that, because you don't want to just take it on their word, yeah, we got you. You want to understand what's really going on behind the scenes so that you can speak to it internally, you can demonstrate to your auditors, et cetera. Because there could be different recovery methods going on behind the scenes. Maybe you're using replication to get the data to the offsite data center. In that case, you're just clicking a button, failing over. Maybe you're actually performing a full recovery of that data. In that case, well, what are the speeds? How quickly are you going to be able to recover my data? I've got 25 terabytes, right? Is that going to take an hour? Is that going to take 24 hours? What are we looking at? So understand that, and you'll be in a better position, I think.
Yep, exactly. And I think that, that kind of ties into one of the things I say all the time is, look, service level agreements are great, and certainly you want those from your provider, but understand that in the end, all the service level agreement does is give you the ability to sue in case something doesn't go wrong. It doesn't
right.
Get your data back. It doesn't turn back time. You still have to suffer through the outage. So understanding how your provider can do certain things to make sure that that SLA is worth the paper it's written on or the document that's written on is super critical, right?
That's so true. I mean, that SLA, that gets you your day in court, gives you a real basis to stand on to get some money back, to sue for damages, but it really doesn't get you your data when you need it, right? That's where it's the vendor's reliability, the technology reliability, and that testing that you've done that's really going to get you your data back when you actually need it.
Exactly correct. So I think that ties in really well with the next thing is really understand the provider's capabilities, and so some things to think about are how much network and compute do they have available to run your applications? And again, another thing that I like to point out at this point is when I declare and I have a provider and that provider is now hosting my application, my relationship with that provider has instantaneously changed, right? That provider has gone from a really nice place that I back stuff up to now essentially you're my compute provider, at least for a period of time.
Real, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And now we're partners. And right,
exactly.
I treat you just like I would. We're in the same conference room. You better have my data up and running because my whole company's depending on it, right? So we're in this together.
Absolutely. And I describe it as you're moving from dating to marriage at that point, right? So, it becomes a really important thing to understand. And then I think broadly is disasters, disasters obviously come in a lot of different forms. Many disasters are isolated to a single entity or a single organization. But there are those occasional regional disasters where hundreds of companies could be impacted. And if that provider happens to bear the brunt of, let's say, 100 companies declaring at the same time, you got to think of the network and the compute and all of their capabilities as it relates to, okay, now we have 6 really important apps per customer, and we have 100 customers declaring. Now I'm running 600 apps all of a sudden. Now what's it going to look like?
That's right, because there's manpower constraints there. There's resource constraints on the equipment they're using on the back end. Stressful situation. So you want a provider who's not just blindly signing up everyone and anyone, regardless of their data or their FEMA zone. You want someone who's actually keeping close track and then scaling based on that, right? Based on their hiring practices, how much compute and memory they're buying for that back end. How many customers do we have in our largest FEMA zone? What's the next highest? And what if they both declare at the same time? How are we going to handle that and meet our SLAs?
Exactly correct. So and I think that there's another important thing that people forget is sort of this: how do you get back, right? At some point, unless you're going to permanently stay in that provider's cloud, you're probably going to want to bring your applications back. And if it's a situation where you had a total data center wipeout, all the efficiencies that we use to back you up on a daily basis might not be as effective. And so is there a way to do some kind of a bulk load or a bulk recovery, or is there a way to replicate back and then do a final sync array? So these are just, again, there's not necessarily the perfect way to do it in any situation, but understanding what that process is going to look like as you recover is also critical.
Well, so true. I mean, you may only stay in your provider's cloud for minutes if it was just some planned maintenance, hours, days, weeks. We've had customers who've stayed on our infrastructure, our DR as a service infrastructure, for 9 months after a critical hurricane came through, because they were still reconstituting, rebuilding their production environment to their liking. And so clearly, you're not going to lose 9 months worth of work. You need a bulletproof way to get all that data, all those changes you were making in the cloud, in the DR site, back to your production site when it's ready. So.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I think that those are really key things to think about. And the other thing to think about that I don't know if we have in there, but is so that 9 months thing is a really good one, right? So while you're at the provider, does the provider have a way to back you up while that's going on, right? Because you can't run for 9 months without a backup. So having another backup process kick in while you're in the provider is important too, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And ideally, I mean, that's your production data. You're making production changes even though it's in the DR provider's cloud. You want to run the same backup strategies you've been running in production, because you're going to have the same requirements, right? Users are still going to misplace data. You still, have audit requirements, all of that. So you want to ideally, run the same strategy, run the same frequency for all of your data, even while in the DR provider's cloud.
Exactly. So then let's also talk about the sort of what I call the the next big critical element for success, which is testing application recovery frequently. Now, this kind of is good news, I think, in the DraaS world, right? Because it should be now much easier to test your ability to recover from a disaster. You should be able to, I don't want to say just as simple as flipping a button, but pretty close. And you should be able to simulate a disaster. It should no longer have to be this quarterly event that everybody dreads, that, we lock you in a room for, a weekend and, you hope it all works. Now it should be a pretty straightforward process, right?
Well, I agree. And technology, virtualization, and a lot of different other strategies out there have come a long way in making that easier, simplifying that. Almost made it too easy, right? Because, like you said, you can push a button and, oh, good, my SQL Server works. I saw SQL database, ran a couple queries on the other end. We're looking good. Certainly, the reverse of that is it's not just good enough to have your server come up if your services don't start, or your SQL Server is not talking to your web front end, or whatever it is. So you want to test all that. Ideally, if you can test it more than just clicking a button, but actually give it a thorough real-world test, that'll be even more ideal and really set you up for success in the event of a disaster.
Exactly. And so I think that's our last bullet there, is be thorough. Make sure that the recovery is complete from the application start all the way to user login. Make sure, because that'll make sure that all those services come together. Make sure you understand that, when you bring application A up, it's going to have dependencies on certain services like DNS and Active Directory and, things of that nature. Now, the other thing is, and this kind of ties, this might sound like we just repeated ourselves, but Jason and I talked about this, and we both felt it was really important to differentiate. And the kind of the temptation, I think, with disaster recovery as a service is, because DR is so easy, is you no longer do this real world thing. So you might not have to do this go away for a weekend and see what happens type of deal. But because the simulation of disaster recovery is so easy with disaster recovery as a service, you got to make sure you occasionally perform a real world situation. And the way I describe that, Jason, is, go to a Starbucks and see if you can recover some applications, right? And see what happens. What do you think?
Well, I agree, because if you only push that button every quarter, you check that box, you report on it in that meeting that we're good, you've done something, but you've you've not considered, perhaps as realistically as you could, the non-technology parts of your disaster recovery strategy. Where are my people going to go, right? What are they physically going to do when they get to that Starbucks, 30 miles across town? What's that going to look like? Are they going to experience any challenges? Is their experience going to be any different? Are they trained for that? So those people and equipment, personnel kinds of issues that are aside from just bringing up your applications that are going to really affect, in a stressful situation, your recovery.
Exactly. And so I think it's really important to, I don't know, I put turn on-prem servers off, and I don't know, maybe that's probably a little too far, but make sure that you leave the building, I think, is the big one for us, is do it remotely, because you might not be there and things like that. And try to get a lot of users running against the app so you can see what performance in your provider is going to look like. And I think those are really the two key things. So, Jason, just to summarize before I shoot it back to you, just to kind of hit these 5 steps. One is, and you guys nailed it on the vote, right, is complete data protection. Make sure that if you have things that aren't virtualized, often they're not virtualized for a reason. Make sure you have some way to protect those. The second is make sure you continue to meet your RTO and RPO challenges. And I think, Jason kind of nailed it, is, don't take the just trust me as an answer, right? That you got to understand how and where your provider is going to meet those different expectations. And then, again, that ties into the next one, which is understanding the provider's capabilities. I like to always say SLAs are good and they give you something to suit, but I want to know what you have. I want to know what your processes are. I want to give you situations. And so make sure you do that as well. And then the last 2 is test application recovery frequently. Do take advantage of the fact that it is so darn easy, and test it more often, right? So maybe even weekly on your mission critical applications. But at the same time, don't totally give up on the real world DR test. Make sure you simulate the fact that you're not at your data center anymore and you're going to try to do this remotely. I know one CIO that required their team to recover everything from a tablet. And that was the simulation. They had to leave the building and initiate a disaster recovery from tablet devices. So that I'm not necessarily suggesting you go to that level, but that's just some ideas of what we see. So now, Jason, why don't you kind of take it away and talk a little bit about how you guys play into that situation.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, George. All right. So really, we like to think about 3 questions to ask for, are you prepared for disaster? What's the state of data in your organization? How secure is your data, and how easily can you recover data? So we normally find that, data in your organization may be sprawling, may be growing. You may be changing operating systems, upgrading applications, that kind of thing. So your data is very dynamic. You definitely want to continue to update your disaster recovery plan as that data continues to grow, change as you bring in new servers, et cetera. Security is also a part of it, because if the bad guys can get at your data, whether it's in your production environment or whether it's in the DR provider's cloud, you're going to be in a bad spot. So you definitely want to consider security as part of your DR plan. And then how easily can you recover that data? Like George was saying, is it just the push of a button and you failed over to the cloud? That's great. Is there more to it than that? Is something going on behind the scenes? Is it very manpower intensive? Is it automated? Get an understanding of that. What's your role? What will your team be responsible for, especially if there's been a disaster and you might be caring for your loved ones, making sure all of your employees are safe, but also you have to go and do it yourself, recover the full environment? Or is that something your DR as a service provider is assisting with, is taking on fully? Just understand that going and get that documented. So we actually commissioned a survey to ask some IT professionals what they're looking for in a DR solution. So we found that things like recovery capabilities were very important, customer support, how easy is it to use the solution, how reliable is the solution. And these are all things that we've talked about in this webinar today. And so while some of these rank a lot higher than the others, perhaps security and compliance, recovery, I think all of them are important, so you definitely want to get the right fit for your company when you're working with these vendors to see which direction you're going to go for your DR as a service solution. So how does Carbonite do it? How do we get data quickly and efficiently to the cloud so that we can perform this DR recovery solution? Well, on the front end, there's a lot of efficiency. In other words, we have some front-end deduplication looking only for the changes within the files. So if I were to change this PowerPoint presentation, slide 27, I make a small change, I add a bullet point, the solution will only send that change at the 32K block level, not have to resend the entire PowerPoint presentation. So from a bandwidth perspective, from a storage perspective, it's very efficient, and so that means that your budget can go further for the project. You don't need expensive bandwidth upgrades. You don't need to spend more on extra storage to get all those historical retentions that you want. Same thing, the solution can throttle down on the bandwidth so you can determine when backups will occur and how much bandwidth they're going to consume while they're ongoing. Lastly, the vault, which is the target where all the agents send their data, is going to perform additional maintenance, additional deduplication, along with replication to another vault so that you have no single point of failure. But it's going to continue to keep that back-end footprint as efficient as possible by getting rid of the older retentions, reclaiming any duplicate data, that kind of thing, again, so that your budget doesn't have to go crazy trying to pick up a backup and a disaster recovery solution. So we all know that it's not really about the backup. That's great, but that's really just preparing you for the recovery. And there's different kinds of recoveries. I think the most frequent, is, well, someone deleted the budget spreadsheet from the finance folder. Okay, no problem. You just go back and get those files and folders. Or, a crypto locker virus is holding your data ransom, so you want to recover, all of the affected files from your last good backup before the virus hit. So that's very easy to do through our portal. But another thing is the server. You've lost an entire server, Exchange server's down, SQL server's been hit by a virus, who knows? You can use BMR, bare metal recovery, to restore the entire server. If it's a virtual machine, you can restore the entire server through our vSphere agent, Hyper-V agent. So that's, I would say, the next most frequent kind of recovery. But then what we've been talking about a lot today is what happens if your entire site is down. There's a huge networking issue, a widespread virus, an actual physical disaster, or even a technological disaster that's keeping your site down, and you need to go to your vendor. In that case, we have, again, bare metal recovery. We have cloud disaster recovery against different time frames, guaranteed time frames, whether it's an hour, 24 hours, 48 hours, to get your data back in a time frame that works for you. Okay.
Thanks, Jason. So great. You're like the fastest vendor presenter ever, and I know everybody really appreciates that. You guys you should get right to it. So that's awesome. So anyways, yeah, we're going to send you a gold star, man. Absolutely. Yeah, FedEx. We're going to send it FedEx. So be on the lookout for it. So anyways, before we get to your questions, couple of things. So first, all the webinars are available on demand. So if you came in late, feel free to jump back in. You're right on our channel already. You can navigate right to our channel and see all the on-demand events. You also see a few, more than a few, actually 4 or 5 upcoming events. So feel free to register. You don't have to rekey any of your information and all that. Second thing is on the bottom of your player, again, there's an attachments button. You can click on that. I can see that some of you guys have already hit it, and download a lot more information, goes into some detail, so in case you need some written backup, all that'll be there as well. And then finally, just as another reminder, just as a personal favor to me, if you'll go in and rate today's webinar and provide some feedback, there's a little text box in there. So always appreciate a little bit of extra feedback on kind of what we're doing, and maybe even suggestions for future events, things like that. We always like that kind of stuff. So with the housekeeping out of the way, let's jump into the Q&A section. Jason, we got a lot of questions in here. So if you'll do me a favor and go in and prioritize some of those so we can make sure we get to the right ones. I'm going to answer this one. There's one that came up a little earlier on security, and I thought that would be kind of a good place to start. So I get that a lot, Jason, about cloud security and is it safe and all that kind of good stuff. And so my first thing is, okay, wait, most cloud or providers that I deal with, their security is often better than the data center that's making the accusation, so to speak. So I think that's so there's no perfect, I think, security situation, but cloud providers know that you're going to ask about security and in general go to great lengths to do everything they can to secure data. And then there's things specifically that a provider can do to kind of enhance or make that environment even more secure. And so just to kind of tee it up to you, Jason, what do you guys do as it relates to security?
Well, sure. I think most important is you want to have an outside third party come in and certify you, give you that documentation. They've looked at your people, right? Background checks. They've looked at your processes. They've looked at your technology. They've looked at your data centers. Who can get into this data center? What's the process? Once they're in, what can they do? How do they get to the cage? Similarly, is the data encrypted? Okay, using what technology? Are there any weaknesses? Check for any cert updates that speak to the technology you're using. There have been some vulnerabilities discovered. So I think all of that, and then having that documented and under non-disclosure agreement, being able to provide that to your customers and talk through it with them, really gives your customers a sense of security about your security practices, and that you're continuing to keep those updated as you go.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So let's take this one here. Another issue with DraaS is how users get at data. Let's say the whole site is gone. Many businesses don't have a terminal server, assuming users even have a work laptop. So Jason, what do you think about that? It's kind of more of a comment, but
yeah, it's
what do you
a good
think
question,
about that?
Right? We kind of talked about it in the webinar, is connectivity to the environment, right? Because it's very easy when you come into work and you sit at your workstation and it just works, right? You take the networking for granted almost until you can't go into the office. You either have a laptop or a tablet and you're stuck, you're at your Starbucks or wherever, 50 miles away. What is that process? Are you using VPN to get connected? Does it require a VPN client? Have you downloaded that client? Do you even know where to get that client? Does your IT department, have they provided any instructions on where to get the client from the web, what to do? Maybe it's already preloaded. So are you using the site-to-site tunnel from your secondary site? Okay, well then you got to drive across town and test that as well. So I think going through those possibilities, whether it's site-to-site tunnel, whether it's VPN connectivity, get the client downloaded, get your users comfortable with it, get, like you said, 50 or 100 of them to log in at the same time, make sure there's no performance issues. That way when a disaster hits, they know what they're going to do to get into that cloud environment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's really good feedback. So here's another one. How does your organization define always on in the cloud versus on demand in the cloud? That will determine compute requirements.
Well, sure. I think, again, the way I think about it, whether it's what the asker meant or not, but I think about it as, you've got real-time replication for a hot site. So you've got servers in the cloud that are on all the time, receiving your real-time updates. All you do, you fail over, you're looking at 5 minutes or less, and you're up. Okay, that still needs to be tested, but it's quick. The other possibility is you're actually recovering from backups. So they're not always on. I mean, some Some space is pre-allocated based on the number of customers you've sold to and how much equipment you have, but you're actually going to be restoring on demand in the event of a test or an actual declaration. And I think, of course, the price will be different. The experience will be a little bit different for those two services. The recovery times will be different, but I think that's what the organization should consider. And even to tie into another question, do a lot of organizations tier their data? Absolutely. So you might have your critical data where you want that real-time replication solution at a slightly premium price. And then you have your more historical stuff or your less timely information where you need it back, but 24, 48 hours is okay, so you go for that slightly lower tier at that slightly lower price. And so you can have all of that included in your DR plan and tested at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's vital, right? I think that in a disaster, and when I go around and speak on disaster recovery, I think one of the things we always try to remind people is, look, in a disaster, you're not bringing everything back, probably, right? Unless, except for your example, the guy that was in your data center for 9 months, right? They probably eventually recovered most of their stuff. But if it's a short-term sort of maintenance thing, or, you know, a good example that I see a lot just because I live in the South is hurricanes, right? Where you probably declare just in case the hurricane hits you, but you're only going to start up the most critical applications, and then once the hurricane veers off and hits another city, you just want to bring it all back, right? So it'll vary, and really in a disaster, you want to bring back as little as you possibly can initially, and then so you can assess the situation and figure out what else you bring back. Does that make sense?
I think that's spot on, because you're certainly, if you've got, you know, hundreds of terabytes in your environment, but, you know, you've got a large chunk of it that's archive data, you know, the budget from 2012 or whatever, that your team just doesn't need on a day-to-day basis. It's mainly there for compliance reasons or whatnot. You don't need to bring that back first, if at all, unless you're going to live in the data center for 9 months, right? So I agree with you. You really find out what's critical when a disaster hits, because you know exactly what your people need or what they're calling for. Get that recovered first.
Exactly. Now, just if you're listening, feel free to keep asking us questions. We, on purpose, leave plenty of time for Q&A because we want to get your guys' questions answered, not just tell you what we think. So we move through these pretty quickly and save plenty of time for questions. I did, however, put our contact information up on the screen, so if you need to reach out to either myself or Storage Switzerland or Carbonite, all that contact information is up there as well. So, and of course, like I said before, the attachments are there, so please feel free to engage with those. So Jason, another one for you. What are the top reasons for the disaster that you've seen? What are the top system failure, accidental deletion, viruses, malware, ransomware? Well, I listed them all. Corrupted
Sure.
data, cyber attack, natural disaster. Anyways, I think we get the point. What's the top one?
I think that the big ones, right, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the fires, I think though that's a lot of the themes and stories we think about when we think about disaster recovery, I think that actually those are the least frequent. I think downtime. You know, Microsoft had some updates that tried to run at 1:30 at night, and it didn't take properly, or my server didn't reboot properly, or it should have rebooted and it didn't. And I've got downtime. I mean, that's not an earthquake, but it is downtime. My users can't hit their mailbox. So I think those kinds of hardware failure. You know, there's a the 2 disks are bad in a RAID, and I can't boot up my SQL box or whatever it is. Those are a lot more frequent, you know, a virus hits a server, than the big ones, right, the earthquake that takes out a whole city. So I think plan for those smaller technological hiccups and what you're going to do when those inconveniences hit, so that you can reliably have a really high uptime for your organization, your customers.
Yeah, exactly. The way I like to break it down is there's a set of disasters that are disastrous for your personal career. And those are the ones where the organization is in fine, except for whatever reason an application went down or a system update didn't take, things like that. And then there are disasters that are disasters for the organization that could literally put the whole the whole organization out of business, right? And so if you look at those two, you got to really cover both of them. And the frequency is really going to be much more on the side of the stuff that's going to impact you personally, right? That the things that you listed, storage system failures, application failures, operating system update mistakes, things like that. Those are the ones that are going to, make you A, lose all your hair, and B, be the things that happen the most frequently. So let's move along here, Jason. Here's a good one. My biggest concern is actually time and complexity to configure ahead of time. There's a good one. So in your guys' world, how long does it take to, let's say you got I don't know if we got a greenfield customer anymore, but you got a guy running backup solution A, and he wants to switch to you guys. What's that process look like?
Well, sure. In part, it will depend on what solution he's going with. Is he going with real-time replication solution, which we would call CDR1? Okay. Is he going with a traditional backup and recovery solution paired with maybe a CDR 2448? Similar, but not identical. But the general workflow is you want to get, if there's going to be an on-site appliance to back up to, you want to get that out and configured, get the agents deployed to the different operating systems, physical virtual machines, whatever it is, out there, get them backing up either directly to the cloud or to an on-site appliance and then replicating to the cloud. Once that data is seeded up to the cloud, whether it was through shipping, a USB drive, shipping a mobile vault, a server in a suitcase to collect that initial set of backups or even that initial replication data, get it up to the cloud, import it in, and then you're only looking at sending just the changes or the deltas thereafter, about 1% of the size of your data. Once it's up there, then the true disaster recovery testing and planning can begin, and the documentation. So we generally see, of course, depending on the amount of data, whether they have an on-site appliance or not, you might be looking at a week to two if you have an appliance to get it shipped out, get it configured, get all the backups set up and seeded. If you're doing that seeding through a device, get that shipped back to the data center. Then you're ready to actually start doing your DR testing. And that's included as part of the initial onboarding is a full test of all servers documented. So including that back-end DR test, you might be looking at 4 to 6 weeks with all of it, right, from backups to full DR test documentation provided. Quicker if it's less, but that's a good idea.
Awesome. So, by the way, you guys are asking great questions. I think that one of the requirements is all of you on the webinar have to attend all of the rest of all of our webinars because you guys are just asking phenomenal questions. Here's a great one. Why DraaS instead of just moving the entire production data center to the cloud and have the hosting provider worry about DR? For example, with Office 365, email, SharePoint, and file storage are all in Azure, and Microsoft worries about disasters. So, okay. So A, yeah, you could do that. B, a lot of people won't. And C, I would be worried about Microsoft worrying about all my disasters because you get into these situations now, if you are totally dependent on the cloud, you probably need to look at another cloud to get your data to in case something goes wrong with the first cloud, right? And so there are a ever-increasing number of solutions that are backing up Cloud A to Cloud B. I'll give you an example. Storage Switzerland's a very small company. We are I guess now a G Suite shop, but we back all of our data up to Amazon, right? Because for that concern. And so I think that's number one. And I think probably the other thing is there are certain applications that for whatever reason you're just not going to put in the cloud. And so I think that's the other variable too. What are your thoughts on this, Jason?
Well, yeah, when you move to, an Amazon or a Google or a Microsoft, nothing wrong with that. Great names, very reliable companies, still have outages, of course, with your business critical data, but you're giving up a sense of control. There's the loss of control. You can't go into your data center and touch the server that it's running on. It's 1,000 miles away in XYZ data center, being managed by a big name who's also thinking about DR, but they're thinking about DR for, millions of customers, and And whereas you are thinking solely about your customers' data. So I like George's point. You've got it in, one cloud provider. As a DR strategy, make sure that it's going to another cloud provider on the idea that both cloud providers are unlikely to go down at the same time, unless we're talking about something huge, might be affecting the entire nation or something. But
right,
a good point.
Yeah, I would think if Google and Amazon go down at the same time, it's a bad day generally, right? So, and I'll tell you that the thing that we are really hitting the vendors that talk to us, so you guys don't ever get to listen to our briefing calls, but they would be pure entertainment for anybody in IT. But one of the things we pick on vendors about is, okay, yeah, Google probably won't suffer a massive failure. Amazon might not suffer a massive failure. But what if you have a rogue employee go in and hijack your account? Right? We have just in Storage Switzerland helping people, we have 3 documented cases where a rogue employee got admin passwords and logins and re-encrypted all the data and then left. If you don't have a backup, Amazon and Azure and Google can't help you. It just got re-encrypted. So having that capability, and that's very real, right? I'd have to stretch a little bit to figure out a way I would have to be able to take all of Google down or all of Amazon down, and although it has happened. But that, having a rogue employee and or a hacker, is a very real situation and something you need to protect yourself from.
That's like a punch in the gut, George, when you find out that your data is being held ransom by either a rogue employee who will not be giving you the encryption password, or by some sort of ransomware virus where you need to make a payment to get your data back. It's really very infuriating, and you feel almost helpless.
Yeah, and if you want an example of this, if you're on the line, just Google cloud spaces, and you'll find a vendor that had that exact situation happen to them. All right, so back to this. Do clients want automatic failover without any manual intervention? Is that something you hear people asking for, Jason?
Some clients do, because they don't want to be bothered by a call at 1:30 in the morning to say, do you authorize this to fail over your SQL server? We can't ping it in your production. Shall we move it to the DR site? Yes, do it. I'm trying to get some rest for the next day here. So just automate that process and really make it easier for my team. Absolutely. But the other side of the coin is many companies want to know where their data is. Have I failed over or not? I want to know that. So I want to give the go ahead before we push the button, so that I can answer internally and to customers exactly. I know where my data is. It's in the cloud or it's not at this point in time.
Yeah, exactly. So a question came up about just getting access to the slides. So right after the webinar, we'll put the slides as a PDF in the attachments. And so just come back in. You don't have to listen to the whole thing all over again. Just log in long enough to click on the attachments button, and you can get that. So we'll get that one done. Let's see. So Jason, we're basically at the top of the hour. Let's end with this one. This is a great one, actually, to end with. In the past couple of years, have disasters or disruptions increased or decreased?
Well, sure. Well, I think everyone would agree they've increased, because it's a lot easier to attack someone now. Everyone who's online is now a target. There's these 24/7 support help desks globally who help the bad guys deploy their malware against your systems, right? And I'm having a problem getting my malware working, so they'll actually help you and automate that and script that for you, get you going there. So there's new vulnerabilities discovered every day. Things have more and more dependencies on each other. So I think downtime, whether it's through system failure, physical, drive failure, employee incompetence, just human error, including viruses as well, and then the natural disasters that occur once in a while, I think and so definitely something you want to consider in your day-to-day IT career.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the other thing I would add to that is we're becoming so much more dependent on everything being online, right? The other day, I probably shouldn't say the name of the airline, but as you do probably a lot, Jason, I am on a plane often, and the app was down, and so I went to their website, and the website was down, and I'm thinking, oh, I wonder what I do, and it took 5 minutes for it to occur to me to actually make a phone call. I've forgotten how to do that. It's a lost art, right? And so we're so dependent on these systems to be available to us, and the expectation of the people that engage with your systems, you being the people on the line, their expectations are so high that their expectations that you will never go down. So it's that as well. So not only are we being attacked more, and we've got all that going on, but also the sensitivity to loss is so high that, 20 years ago, if your server went down, the people had paper and they could still do work. Now, I don't know, right?
Right. I mean, your customers, even your coworkers, your employees, that tolerance for downtime is near zero, right? People expect everything to be working all the time. So when an app's not working or a website is not working, you quickly lose confidence in that company. Like, they can't get their act together, their website's down, what's going on? I don't know if I want to do business with this company. They don't know the story behind the scenes, what the IT team is doing to rush to put out the fire, but they just see, Amazon.com is down. Well, I guess I'll go somewhere else.
Yep, exactly. So we're going to end it there. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for participating and putting your questions in. There were a few that we didn't get to. We'll respond to those offline. I just want to remind everybody that the attachments button is there, and yes, we will upload a PDF of the presentation there here in just a second. The on-demand version will be available probably about 5 minutes after we're done with this webinar. I also want to remind you to click on the attachments. All those are right there. And then one final request to provide us with feedback, what you thought about the presentation is always good. And also, I always like suggestions for new webinars that we should do. So for Jason Earley, I am George Crump, founder of Storage Switzerland, and want to thank you for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. But until then, have a great day.